Hey guys, welcome to our channel here at MedPro Prep. Today we're going to go over some of the tips and tricks that we use to kind of get into medical school and for medical school interviews in general. I think Adisha is going to share three. I'm also going to share three, and then we can kind of talk a little bit about them. So let's get right into it. First off, what's your, I guess, number one tip for medical school interviews, you'd say?
Yeah, so probably the most important thing that I tell a lot of my students is evidence. And what I mean by evidence is when you're talking about your experiences, especially in a question that's like, oh yeah, name some experiences or what is something that's caused you to overcome. I believe the phrase they use is overcome adversity. That's a very popular question. A lot of people, for example, say, uh, oh yeah, I had an experience XYZ and it made me feel bad. So instead of telling your interviewee how it made you feel, such as mad, sad, happy, frustrated, it's better to use evidence. And what I mean by that is to say exactly what happened so
Mhm.
that the interviewee can see and make a judgment for themselves. Like, for example, in my med school essay, I went into a little bit of one of my friends who had a disease, and I told the interviewee like, hey, this is what age this happened. This is how I saw my friend, how he declined, and how it affected him. And basically, by the way I talked about the my friend, I didn't have to explain like, oh yeah, like it made me feel sad or made me feel upset. Like that can be inferred. And I think that's very important for a lot of interviewers because a lot of interviewers would rather use a lot of adjectives to describe themselves. And I think a really big tip is just, letting the interviewee judge it for themselves by giving them evidence, by giving them the actual experience you had in talking about that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. That absolutely makes sense. I think I agree. Like having evidence for any point is helpful,
Yeah.
just to like kind of prove your point. I guess one of my biggest tips, I think, to the people we've helped coach is making sure to actually, I feel like, expand on your thoughts. I feel like a lot of people think that a big thing I notice is they kind of provide a simple explanation, like, oh, I did this. And as you talked about, evidence kind of fits into this, but kind of expanding on it, like talk about specific details. And I think that's where the key comes in. Like, yeah, it's cool that you won whatever prize, but talk about like the mission and the goals and like how it was to get there. Like, what were the steps? How did you
Mm-hmm.
do it? Like, I feel like a lot of people are like, oh yeah, I'm gonna use like a 2 second response, but that's not how it's supposed to be. They really want to know your life, and you don't want to assume in these interviews. You want to provide as much as you possibly can in these, and I think that's being descriptive and making sure that you provide kind of the evidence that you were talking about. I think is really key.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like if by doing that you can get an interviewee to be much more impressed, actually just pay more attention because you're actually, providing interesting information. Something else
Absolutely.
that me and you have talked about, which having a bad example of right now, is body language.
Yeah.
So a big part of it, especially in now and since like post COVID, I know some schools are going back to doing in person interviews, but it's even
Yeah.
important just for in person or Zoom interviews is the way you present yourself. So, for example, like sitting up straight and leaning forward, nodding your head,
Yeah.
using your hands when you talk. Even like us, whenever we're making videos and things, have to keep these things in mind to make it more interesting because it's kind of like me and Adish have figured out human behavior and all. And this is not just for medical school interviews; it's for any
Yeah.
interview you can apply
Any
this
video
for.
thing, honestly.
Literally, just sitting forward shows your interviewee that, hey, I'm interested and I'm like leaning forward and I'm interested in what you have to say. I'm very engaged in this. And humans have this kind of subconscious thing where you're sitting kind of like lackadaisically and, not using your hand, just kind of speaking like this, like the talking head. And
Yeah.
you can even see it on YouTube. You're not going to get the views. You're not going to get the attention that you want. And so I always tell, especially since post COVID, I believe, now some of the interviews are in person, is sit forward, nod your head whenever the interviewee is talking, using your hands, and basically being able to express that you have an interest in what you're doing. You want to be there, and you do want to be there. You want to get into medical school. So
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's only a good second tip for people. I think my second tip is going to be something that's probably talked about, but not in the same way as we talk about it. And that's kind of having confidence, but not
Mm,
having like overconfidence and not being like, if you haven't prepared or haven't kind of sat down and gone over things, sounding like you know everything. I think that's a big thing that some people come off as if they haven't prepared or haven't prepared properly is they come into this
mm,
interview thinking that they're going to know everything, they're going to have the best response to everything possible, and they end up
right.
getting something blindsiding them, and then they end up kind of failing because they had so much confidence before, and seeing themselves struggle is just terrible, especially with the new multiple mini interviews. I feel like that's a big thing. I think
Mm,
for people now, I think it's more important to prepare than ever, and then also understand that in those types of interviews, you're not going to like knock every single one out of the park, even though we'd all love to, obviously. But staying and
mm.
maintaining confidence throughout and not being too overconfident is, I think, really key for people these days.
Yeah, absolutely. Because if you go in, like, I agree, like you should be confident in that, like, I know what I'm doing, I know the
Yeah,
responses I'm going to give. But then you also don't want to just show up and be like, oh yeah, I'm not showing any humility, which I feel like not just in your interviews, but like all throughout medical school
in life, yeah,
rotations, yeah, and life, you just have to show humility because you don't know who's looking at you, you don't know who's judging you, and the biggest thing is first impressions, right?
yeah, absolutely,
Because like if your first impression is that I'm cocky and that I'm not willing to learn or sit down and I know everything, well, that's like the complete opposite of what we do in medical school. A lot of medical school, honestly, is just being quiet and listening and learning.
yeah,
I mean, that's a
absolutely,
lot of that. I mean, that was my entire surgery rotation. It's just
yeah,
like sitting there and basically soaking in what's going on. So
yeah, absolutely,
I think that's a great point. And I think for my last tip, I it's kind of like an expanded tip, but being able to answer the question, what are your three strengths and what are your three weaknesses, that has come up again and again and again for medical school interviews, for business, for in my case business school interviews, for
yeah,
military interviews, like all of my interviews and every interview moving forward, even when you're trying to get your first job as a future doctor, your employer will more likely than not ask you that.
yeah,
So
absolutely, yeah.
uh,
Most commonly asked question for sure.
no, yeah, for sure, because it's kind of like a chance for you to talk about yourself but also be honest. So like I
Yeah,
brought some examples for myself. So like some of my strengths I feel like is very passionate about what I do, if that's not evident, med pro prep and just my body of work in medical school. I'm extremely passionate. I'm not going to just do something just to do something. Also work ethic, and then I wrote down humor. And so like basically that provides like three different avenues that you can talk about your strengths, and then I would then provide evidence. So again,
yeah,
going back to the initial point, is all this stuff ties in, because then you'd be like, oh yeah, so I'm passionate, but you can't just say I'm passionate. You need to be able to then express like what you've done, what is the evidence you provide for your interviewee to see what you're passionate about, if that makes sense.
yeah,
And then
absolutely,
for weaknesses, like I was just thinking, like you could have something like anxiety. I myself am an anxious person. I get worried about a lot of things and provide, and then an example of that. And then I think in my med school interview, I talked about being clumsy because I'm 6'6" and had a really bad, I had very hard time growing into my body growing up. So,
yeah,
and even now, it's sometimes evident, and it shows in medicine too, because when you're doing surgery and other things, you have to have a lot of attention. But another key point in talking about your weaknesses that's different from your strengths, I think, is being able to talk about how you've overcome them or your plan to overcome them, because
yeah,
that shows your employer. And also another huge thing is how that will translate to your future, if that makes sense. So
yeah,
let's say you have problems with attention, okay, then you talk about like, okay, yeah, this is what happened, this is XYZ happened. Like let's say I have a hard time paying attention at work, and then this led to this, like my manager talking to me, and then these are the steps I took to overcome that, and this is how that relates to medicine, and that's what I'm going to do with medicine moving forward. So
yeah,
all these things kind of add on and create a whole picture, if that makes sense. So
for sure. I think that's like a great tip just for like not only medicine, but even if you guys aren't doing medicine and like considering med school and end up going a different path or anything, that's a helpful like life tip kind of. You need to be able to talk about your strengths and weaknesses and actually
Mhm.
have weaknesses, and then like because some people just try to make their weaknesses their strengths in some weird convoluted way and
Yeah.
nobody likes that. And like just talking about them like that and then being like, okay, yeah, I have a plan to address these. Like everyone has weaknesses. It's okay. We can all admit
Yeah, it's
that
like
we're bad at
I've
something.
heard someone be like, I'm too hardworking, and it's like, no,
What?
that's not gonna work.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
we
Like,
gotta
come
have
on. Like, at
something a little
least phrase
different.
it differently. Like, it's actually a weakness. Like, oh,
Right.
sometimes I like neglect to like my family. Like, that's a fair like
Uh-huh.
weakness that for some people like that they have. Like, they get too engaged. But don't just say like I'm too hardworking. I'm too good of an employee. I'm just so good for this job. Like, no, nobody likes that.
Yeah.
So, yeah. I guess to kind of finish it off, I guess one of my last tips, but I think um, probably one of the better tips that I have is I feel like a lot of people applying to med school and things like that in general are very like they can be very closeted and reserved about like their application, talking to people about it, and kind of seeking help when help is needed. And I really don't understand. I mean I understand it, but I think that's something a lot of people should do because you'd be surprised, I think, as somebody watching this channel, if you talk to people about, hey, like, does anybody know about any resources to get into med school? Does anybody know somebody who's
Hmm.
in med school? Like, how much of if you just reach out to somebody who's in med school that you kind of know, how much they'll respond. I know I get like obviously through med pro prep, but also just through family members and stuff, just random people reaching out and being like, hey, like I need this person, like some help, like could you give them any advice? And a lot of times the advice really does help because like we can look over essays. I know we've looked over for some of your family members and just like people in general, and I encourage other people to do that. Like, hey, like even if you don't want to be part, like if you don't want to enroll in the courses or anything like that, like we'd be happy to help anybody out. I mean, we're here to help you guys, and I think a lot of people out there in medical school are. So just reach out to
Yeah.
your network and try and get some help because you only really got like a couple shots in your life at this if you want to really do it. And so you might as well take every advantage you have. And I think a lot of people don't try and take every advantage they have until it's like too
Hmm.
late or they failed like they failed to get in already and they have to apply next cycle. So I really think that's a big key for me.
Yeah. I definitely agree with that, bro, because it's like even now, like applying, when we apply for residency and also just applying for jobs and stuff, I've
Yeah.
learned like one of the biggest things is it really does matter who you talk to and the
Yeah.
connections you have because you know it could be someone you talked to 5 years ago, but later on they could be the person interviewing you. Like for me, for example, I went to a bunch of like I think it was like info sessions before UMKC 6 year med,
Yeah.
and I met this individual who I believe is from some counselor or something at UMKC, and I had spoken to them a couple times, but then fast forward to my interview, and they were literally standing right in front of me. And they were one of
Yeah.
my and one of my interviewees, and I was like, "Oh,
Yeah.
hey, I know you. Like I've talked to you. Like
You can
we
be
know
more
each other.
comfortable
Like
in
you
everything.
already
Yeah.
know stuff about me. So
Yeah.
yeah, you never know. You literally never know where it can end up going.
Yeah.
So
And so
using
I
those
think that's
resources
that's
are
why
definitely
your network and resources are important. But yeah.
yeah,
I I guess
exactly.
that's it from us for Med Pro Prep today, giving you guys 3 tips each from both me and Adish. And hopefully that kind of helps you guys on your med school journey. If you're interested in kind of more content or just interested in kind of checking us out for help, and just kind of a free consultation as well for interview prep or for resume prep as well, please reach out to us at medproprep.com and feel free to email us also at medproprep@gmail.com. And we'll be happy to hear your requests and whatever you guys have to say. Thank you
Yeah,
for
and
watching.
follow us on Instagram, give us a subscription on YouTube,
Yeah.
and I think
Like,
that
subscribe, comment.
like, subscribe, comment, keep
Yeah.
it active, and then I think Adish is also going to be putting this on Apple Podcasts soon, so look out for that. But thank you guys.
Yeah. Thank you.